They interrupted me 21 times while I was reading my husband's will. The will he wrote with his own trembling hands in the weeks before the sea finally claimed him. I remained silent. I absorbed every barb, every condescending glance, every impatient sigh they believed was too subtle for me to notice. But I had pressed record on my phone before the lawyer ever stepped through the door. And what unfolded in that fog-drenched room would shatter every assumption they held about the quiet woman they called their mother. It was the kind of morning that arrived not with a sunrise, but with a slow lifting of gray. The mist clung to the ancient pines outside the window, their silhouettes stark against the churning Pacific. For nearly 40 years, this view had been my anchor. Arthur would have called it perfect weather for contemplation. He used to say the fog was the ocean's way of thinking, of holding its secrets close. I stood at the kitchen counter, my hands wrapped around a porcelain mug, not for its warmth, but for its solidness. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It was a void, a hollowed-out space that hummed with the absence of his steady presence. For the past 7 months, that void had been Arthur, my husband, the keeper of my heart. That morning, I retrieved the file he had left for me. It was a simple manila folder, worn at the edges with my name, Ilara, written on the tab in his familiar looping script. Inside was the final version of his will. He had composed it by hand, a long, heartfelt letter, even though we had drafted a formal document with Ms. Reed's guidance months before his passing. Arthur was always that way, meticulous, sentimental, a man whose deepest feelings were reserved for the page. He had made me promise to read it aloud when the children returned. "I want them to hear it in your voice, Ilara," he'd whispered, his breath thin as a moth's wing. "It matters that they see your face when you say the words." That part, I think, was the cruelest kindness, the final devastating act of trust. Because today, they were all coming home. Julian was flying in from a high-rise in Chicago. Corinne and her husband were driving down from their glass-walled home in Seattle. Their calls and texts had been trickling in all week, a steady drip of veiled inquiries. Not a single one asked how I was navigating the crushing emptiness of the house. No, their questions were sharp, pointed. They asked about the will, about my intentions for the land, the house, the investment portfolios. Julian had even emailed a slickly designed PDF, a proposal he wanted to strategize with me. I don't know what kind of families other people are born into, but I can tell you this. When your son refers to your home as a legacy asset in an email, a fundamental shift has occurred. When your daughter suggests reimagining the coastal frontage before she's even laid eyes on her father's final testament, something has irrevocably broken. I walked into Arthur's study that morning and placed the folder on his massive oak desk. I stared at the chair where he used to sit, the leather worn into a perfect map of his shoulders. The last cup of tea he'd brewed sat, cold and untouched, beside his reading lamp. I could never bring myself to move it. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the unsaid, pregnant with the impending conflict. And perhaps I knew, even then, what was coming. What I had to read wasn't merely a distribution of assets. It was Arthur's last, desperate plea to hold this family together. And I was beginning to suspect they had no intention of listening. But as I stood there, a quiet, treasonous thought bloomed in my mind. Maybe Arthur wrote that letter knowing they wouldn't hear him. Maybe he wrote it so that I would hear myself say the words aloud, so I would finally stop doubting the truth I already carried in my bones. They weren't coming to honor their father. They were coming to collect. Corinne was the first to arrive, her silver Tesla gliding silently up the gravel driveway. Her husband, a man who always seemed to be appraising his surroundings, remained in the car, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone. She stepped out, her stiletto heels crunching on the wet stones, as if she were entering a boardroom, not the home where she grew up. Her coat was a severe cut of charcoal wool, her hair a perfect immovable sculpture. She didn't pause to look at the sea, didn't notice the climbing roses Arthur and I had planted, now a riot of late-season blooms against the weathered shingles. She came inside, her voice echoing in the foyer, calling my name as if I were a hotel clerk she needed to summon. I heard the clink of her designer bag on the hall table, the confident click of the refrigerator door opening and closing. Julian arrived 2 hours late. There was no apology, just a weary grunt as he dropped his leather weekender in the entryway. He smelled of stale airplane air and expensive cologne. His first question, as he scanned the living room, was not about me, not about how the house felt without its heart, but, "What's the Wi-Fi password again?" They gathered around the dining room table as if for a hostile takeover. Corinne opened her laptop. Julian placed a thick binder next to his coffee cup. They began their presentation. They showed me architectural renderings, brand logos, complex budget spreadsheets. It was a proposal to transform our home, Seacliff, into a luxury wellness retreat. They called it the Vance Legacy Initiative. Not once did they say our family name with affection. To them, it was a brand to be leveraged. Julian laid out their plan as if it were a foregone conclusion, speaking of zoning variances and attracting high-net-worth investors. He insisted they needed to move fast to capitalize on the market. Corinne chimed in with talk of revenue projections and market synergy. She used words like monetize and activation. Her voice was smooth, her language corporate and sterile, but her eyes were sharp, analytical, watching me for any sign of weakness. They weren't asking for my blessing. They were managing my expectations, framing this desecration as if they were relieving me of a burden. Julian said it was the optimal path forward, that it would free me from the strain of maintaining an old home on a rugged coastline. He said it would finally allow me to relax, as if my peace hadn't been shattered the moment they decided to turn their grief into a business prospectus. When I finally asked about Arthur's will, they exchanged a fleeting, almost imperceptible glance. Corinne said they assumed he would have wanted what was best for the family's financial future. Julian offered a hollow laugh. Dad was never one to let a prime asset go underutilized. He then seamlessly pivoted, pushing another document across the table. It was a preliminary agreement, a transfer of partial ownership of the estate to a new LLC they had formed. 60% to them. I stared at the paper, at my name typed in bold above a dotted line, waiting patiently for my signature. They continued to speak, their voices a meaningless drone of numbers and strategies. I rose from the table, walked into the adjoining sunroom, and gently closed the glass-paned doors behind me. I stood there for a long moment, my hand resting on the cool brass handle, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. There was no anger, no fear. There was only a cold, stark clarity. I finally saw it all. This was never about Arthur. It wasn't even about family. It was about leverage. And they were convinced they held all of it. They believed I was a relic, a sentimental old woman who would crumble under the weight of their ambition, but they had no idea of the iron that was still forged inside me. The following morning, the living room had been rearranged. Julian had pushed the familiar coffee table against the wall and set up 3 chairs in a rigid, confrontational arc. Corinne had lit a cloyingly sweet vanilla candle, claiming it would create a calm atmosphere. All it did was suffocate the natural, salty scent of the sea that Arthur had loved. I came downstairs holding the manila folder. The original will was inside, folded once, the paper soft to the touch. Arthur had signed it just 3 days before he was moved to hospice care. His handwriting, usually so bold, had wavered at the end, but his intent was unmistakable. He wanted everything shared equally. He wanted me to read his words aloud, in this room, in front of them. No lawyers, no arguments, just us. I stood while they remained seated. The pages trembled in my hands, not from nervousness, but from the immense gravity of what was to come. I cleared my throat and opened my mouth to begin. "Before you start," Julian interjected, "did you have a chance to review the zoning analysis I sent over?" I met his gaze. "I would prefer we honor your father first." He gave a curt nod, but before I could utter another word, Corinne leaned forward. "Of course, Mother. It's important we hear what Dad wanted. But it's also critical that we view his wishes through a modern financial lens. It's about responsible stewardship of the assets." I began reading. By the third paragraph, Julian cut in again, this time to question whether Arthur had written it entirely on his own, or if Ms. Reed had unduly influenced the language. I informed him that our lawyer had only helped format the initial drafts. This final version was Arthur's heart, in Arthur's hand. He grumbled something under his breath and leaned back, his arms crossed defensively. I kept reading. Corinne stopped me next, demanding clarification on the term irrevocable trust, mentioned in a later section. I told her we would get to that part. She smiled a tight, polished smile and said she just wanted to ensure there were no ambiguities. I started again, but their interruptions became a relentless barrage. They asked about capital gains taxes, about legacy planning, about the logistical complexities of restructuring the accounts. They questioned whether the document had been notarized. They asked if I had made any edits myself. They challenged dates, signatures, even his choice of words. They interrupted me 21 times. I counted each one. Not aloud, not with a pen, but inside my soul, I carved a notch for every single desecration. Each question was a chisel, chipping away at the sacred silence Arthur had envisioned. Each interruption was a deliberate act of erasure, transforming what should have been a moment of shared remembrance into a hostile negotiation. They weren't listening to his words. They were scanning for loopholes. By the time I reached the final heartbreaking sentence, I understood. They had no intention of honoring his will. This was not about understanding his wishes. It was about dismantling them, creating so much noise and confusion that his true meaning would be lost in the chaos. I looked at their faces. Julian was idly tapping a pen against the arm of his chair. Corinne was discreetly scrolling through her phone beneath the table. I slowly folded the will, slipped it back into its envelope, and told them we were finished for the time being. The lawyer would be arriving tomorrow afternoon to formalize everything. Corinne nodded, saying that was for the best. Julian asked if we could circle back to the equity breakdown later, that he had a few refinements to propose. I didn't dignify that with a response. I walked upstairs to our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed where Arthur had spent his final days. My hands were still, my breathing deep and even. The anger had burned away, leaving behind only a cold, hard clarity. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They thought they were wearing me down. In truth, they were only sharpening my resolve, forcing me to see them for who they had become. They were helping me remember the woman I was before the grief, before the silence, before they turned my home into a boardroom. And they had no idea that I had only just begun to truly listen. To them, to Arthur, and to the unwavering voice inside myself. That night, I retrieved the old voice recorder from the back of the hall closet, the one Arthur used to use for his field notes. It had a familiar scuff on the corner where he'd once dropped it on the rocky shore. I checked the batteries. They were still good. It had been years, but my fingers remembered the small, precise buttons. I slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan, a silent, secret witness. The next morning, I made pancakes from scratch, not out of any desire for breakfast, but because the simple, repetitive act of feeding people was something I could control. Corinne picked at hers, already absorbed in emails. Julian ate with a ravenous, joyless efficiency. No one asked if I had slept. No one mentioned the previous day. It was as if the reading of their father's will had been a minor, tedious agenda item they had successfully tabled. At precisely 9:56 a.m., Miss Reed arrived. Her name was Evelyn Reed, and she possessed a calm, unreadable face that exuded competence. I liked her instantly. She greeted Julian and Corinne with a polite but firm professionalism, then took my hand in both of hers, her grip warm and reassuring. I led her to the dining room. I had already placed the recorder, switched on, beneath a linen napkin next to my water glass. Evelyn opened her briefcase and began. She stated unequivocally that Arthur's most recent will had been notarized, filed, and was legally ironclad. She explained the meaning of an irrevocable trust with patient, meticulous detail. She did not condescend to me, and she did not allow Julian to interrupt, though he tried twice. Corinne chimed in once to ask about potential flexibilities. Evelyn's answer was simple and direct. There are none. That is the nature of an irrevocable trust. The allocations cannot be modified without significant legal cause, which in this case does not exist. I saw Julian's jaw clench. Corinne's arms tightened across her chest. Evelyn continued. Arthur's instructions were specific. The house, Seacliff, and its immediate grounds are to remain in Ilara's name for the duration of her life. The remaining land was to be divided equally among the 3 children, including their late sister Clara's share, which was designated for her son, my grandson, Leo. A financial advisor had been appointed to manage the distribution until Leo turned 25. Arthur had also endowed a memorial scholarship in his name at the local maritime academy. I had known about his desire for a scholarship, but I hadn't known he had already funded it with his life insurance policy. That detail struck me like a wave, a sudden, powerful surge of love and sorrow that left me breathless. Julian leaned forward, his voice strained. He asked Evelyn if the property assets could be consolidated into a family LLC for tax efficiency. Evelyn repeated herself, her voice unwavering. The will was final. He then had the audacity to ask if I had been unduly influenced, if perhaps I hadn't fully grasped the legal implications at the time. Evelyn's gaze shifted to me, then back to him, her expression hardening almost imperceptibly. Mr. Vance, this was your father's will, not your mother's. Corinne produced a printout, a list of branding concepts and event ideas. She asked if the trust could be used to fund early-stage renovations of the old boathouse. Evelyn told her no, not without unanimous consent from all beneficiaries, which included Leo's guardian and the trustee. Corinne's practiced smile finally faltered. Julian fell silent, his face a mask of barely contained fury. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. I just want what's best for the family. I said nothing. After Evelyn left, I walked her to her car. As she was about to leave, she paused and told me she'd handled hundreds of family estates. What you're doing takes an incredible amount of courage, Mrs. Vance. I nodded, meeting her gaze. I'm not finished yet, I said. And I wasn't. That small device in my pocket held the undeniable proof of their profound disrespect for their father's final wishes, and I had no intention of letting that truth remain silent. That night, I sat in Arthur's study and played the recording. I listened to every interruption, every dismissive tone, every single time they twisted his memory into a business opportunity. Their voices were so controlled, so reasonable on the surface. But beneath it all thrummed a quiet, chilling entitlement. I labeled the digital file, saved it to a flash drive, and backed it up to a secure cloud server. I performed these small tasks with a slow, deliberate calm. In the 7 months of silence since Arthur's passing, I had learned a vital lesson. Protecting your peace requires preparing for the war you never wanted to fight. The next morning, I began making calls. First to Miss Stay. Read, then to the accountant Arthur had trusted for 3 decades, and finally to the trustee named in the will, a man named Alistair Finch. He had known Arthur since they were boys. I explained what had transpired during the reading and the subsequent meeting with the lawyer. I told him I had a recording. He asked me to send it. I did. By noon, I had an appointment to meet with Alistair at his office the following week. He assured me he would begin preparing a report on the legal standing of the estate and would make a formal notation of any coercive behavior or attempts to subvert the trust. "These things matter, Elara," he said, his voice grim. "They matter a great deal." Julian and Corinne didn't ask where I went that afternoon. They assumed I was running errands. They assumed I was fragile, that my grief had slowed my mind, that my silence was a sign of surrender. But they didn't know I was documenting everything. They didn't know I had kept copies of every draft of the will Arthur had ever written, including the very first version where he had left everything to me outright, before I had gently persuaded him to include them more substantially. They didn't know how many times Arthur had deferred to my judgment, trusting my quiet intuition over their clamorous ambition. That afternoon, Julian invited a local developer to the property without my knowledge. I was trimming the roses by the porch when I saw him walking the man along the cliffside path, pointing towards the old boathouse, gesturing grandly as if the deed was already in his name. When I confronted him, he said they were just gathering preliminary estimates to be proactive. I told him to ask the man to leave. He accused me of being difficult. I said the discussion was over. Corinne watched the entire exchange from the kitchen window, sipping her tea, her expression unreadable, calculating. Later that night, I found a folder left open on the dining table. Inside was a mock budget: construction, marketing, web design. There was a line item labeled Transitional Oversight, Initial Phase. I saw my name next to it in parentheses, followed by the words, Soft roll, to be phased out Q3. It was there in black and white. They had no plan to include me, no intention of honoring what Arthur had built. Their politeness was a temporary strategy, a means to an end while the house was still in my name and the trust was just beyond their grasp. I said nothing. I closed the folder, placed it back exactly as I had found it, and began to pack. Not to leave, but to move everything that truly mattered. Arthur's journals, his sketches, our photographs, his memory, somewhere safer, somewhere their greed could never touch it. By the time they understood what I was doing, it would be too late. All their blueprints and backroom deals would crumble under the weight of the one simple truth they had so arrogantly dismissed. I was still Arthur's wife, still his partner, and I was not done protecting our life's work. 2 days later, I called Leo's guardian, Genevieve. She was Arthur's cousin, a sharp, sensible woman who had raised Leo since we lost his mother, our dear Clara. Genevieve did not suffer fools. I told her everything about the meeting, the interruptions, the Vance Legacy Initiative. I didn't embellish or dramatize. I simply sent her the recording and let their own words speak for them. Within 24 hours, Genevieve called me back. Her voice was cold steel. She had already spoken with Alistair Finch, the trustee. She informed me that she was filing a formal objection to any proposed restructuring of the estate assets on Leo's behalf. She also made it clear that she would not tolerate any form of pressure or manipulation directed at me. I thanked her, my voice thick with emotion. "This isn't for you, Elara," she said gently. "This is for Arthur. It's about respect." That same afternoon, Alistair called to confirm he had documented everything. He was drafting a formal letter of advisory to Julian and Corinne, stating that any further attempts to interfere with the trust's structure could result in legal action. His tone was professional, but I could hear the undercurrent of disdain. He had seen this kind of avarice before. I asked if I should confront them. He advised against it. "Let the documentation do the talking," he said. Still, I knew I had to prepare. They would not go quietly. That night, I went through Arthur's old files. I found the original plans for the terraced gardens, the loan documents from the year a winter storm nearly took the house, the notes he had written in his final months. Arthur had saved everything, not from a lack of trust, but from a deep understanding that memories blur and promises break. Paper, he believed, held the truth. Tucked behind a box of old tax records, I found a small, unassuming folder. Inside were hand-drawn sketches for a community workshop, notes about local veterans struggling with re-entry, ideas for mentorship programs for at-risk youth. At the bottom of one page, he had written in faint pencil, barely legible, "Let them build something that lasts." It wasn't underlined or explained, but my heart understood. Arthur didn't just want to leave them money. He wanted to leave them a purpose, a vision for how the land could serve others, a reason for it to remain whole. The next morning, I scheduled a call with a local nonprofit that focused on youth and veteran outreach. I told them I had a potential proposal, pending some legal clarifications. They were intrigued. They had been looking for a way to expand their programs for years. I didn't tell Julian or Corinne, but I saw Corinne watching me from an upstairs window as I took the call in the garden. Her eyes narrowed, trying to read my posture. Later, I found the boathouse door slightly ajar. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken. Just open. I closed it firmly and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. Whatever they thought they could accomplish behind my back, they were about to learn the lesson Arthur always knew. My quietness was not passivity. My patience was not permission. On the day of the dinner, the one Julian insisted on calling a transition supper, the house felt alien. He had printed little place cards. Corinne had arranged for catered food and lit tall, dripless candles, staging the scene as if for a corporate merger. I wore a simple gray blouse Arthur had loved and the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 35th anniversary. My heart was a calm, quiet sea. After the first course, Julian cleared his throat. It was time, he announced, to discuss next steps. Corinne produced a new folder and began to speak, her voice soft and patronizing. She outlined a vision for the gardens, turning them into a high-end wedding venue. She spoke of revenue streams and scalability. I let her finish. Then I stood. I told them I appreciated their energy, but that the land was no longer available for any business plan. As of that morning, ownership of the terraced gardens, the boathouse, and the adjacent coastal acreage had been legally transferred to a trust in partnership with the nonprofit. It would be designated for educational and community development, exactly as per Arthur's final sketches and legacy notes. Julian froze, his wine glass halfway to his lips. Corinne blinked. "What does that mean for us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I told them the monetary trust remained unchanged. Their shares were intact, but the physical property, the asset they had been circling like sharks, was no longer on the table. It was now protected by a mission they could not touch, a purpose they could not monetize. Corinne's face tightened. "We'll need our lawyers to review this," she hissed. I nodded calmly. "Alistair already has the documentation. So does Genevieve. So does the nonprofit's legal counsel." Brandon's voice, when it came, was raw. "You had no right. You're dismantling everything Dad worked for." I looked directly into his eyes, my own unwavering. "This is exactly what your father worked for, Julian. To leave something behind that would last longer than a balance sheet. To build something meaningful." I sat back down. The silence that fell over the room was absolute, the deafening sound of a hollow empire crumbling. They left without another word. I sat alone at the table long after they were gone, the candles burning low. I felt no triumph, only a profound, quiet relief. I had finally spoken Arthur's truth aloud, and in doing so, I had honored him completely. The next morning, they were gone. A short, unsigned note on the counter spoke of needing space. There was no apology. Later that day, Alistair called to confirm the transfer was airtight. Arthur's legacy was secure. In the weeks that followed, the first group of volunteers arrived, teenagers who learned to prune the old roses and repair the stone walls. We built new benches where Arthur had sketched them, overlooking the sea. The house felt lighter, clearer. One evening, I stood at the window, watching the mist roll in, and I finally understood. True legacy isn't about what you own. It is about what you protect for others. It is not a story of victory or revenge, but one of quiet endurance. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers on the wind, in the steady turning of the tide, in the silent, stubborn act of making something grow. And in that quiet, I could finally hear Arthur again, not in his words, but in the trust he had placed in me to finish what he started, and to remember what truly mattered.